Billionaire Tycoon married a poor woman for a bet. What he discovered left him speechless. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive Sky Club on the 65th floor. Alexander Blackwood adjusted his Italian silk tie as he surveyed the city he'd helped reshape with his real estate empire. At 34, he was worth $4 billion and had the kind of ruthless reputation that made competitors tremble. And socialites swoon. Another boring charity gala conquest, Alex? Marcus Sterling, his closest friend since Harvard, approached with 2 glasses of aged whiskey. The tech mogul's smirk suggested he knew exactly what Alexander had been thinking. "These events are all the same," Alexander replied, accepting the drink. "Same faces, same conversations, same predictable outcomes." He gestured toward the crowd of Manhattan's elite mingling below. "Everyone here wants something from me. A business deal, an investment, or simply to be seen with Alexander Blackwood." Marcus chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "You sound bitter for someone who has everything." "Do I?" Alexander's gray eyes hardened. "Tell me, Marcus, when was the last time someone genuinely surprised you? When did someone look at you and see more than a bank account?" "Fair point," Marcus admitted. "But that's the price of success in our world." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their usual circle: tech entrepreneurs, hedge fund princes, and oil heiresses. The group settled into leather armchairs overlooking Central Park, the conversation quickly turning to their latest acquisitions and conquests. "I just bought a vineyard in Tuscany," announced Bradley Hoffman, a pharmaceutical heir. "The previous owner's daughter tried to convince me she could manage it better than my team. Can you imagine? Some local girl thinking she knows more than my Harvard MBA managers." The group erupted in laughter, but Alexander found himself irritated by their arrogance. "Maybe she did know better," he said quietly. "Come on, Alex," interjected Vanessa Montgomery, whose family owned half of Texas oil wells. "You can't seriously believe that breeding doesn't matter. Look around this room. We're here because we understand how the world really works." "Exactly," Bradley continued. "It's about knowing your place in society. These people from modest backgrounds, they simply don't have our perspective." Alexander set down his glass with more force than necessary. "You're all so certain that wealth equals worth, aren't you?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "Your entire business model is based on recognizing value, and you've never been wrong." The comment hung in the air, and Alexander felt a familiar restlessness. He'd built his empire on calculated risks and perfect judgment, but lately, everything felt hollow. The predictability of his world had become suffocating. "I have a proposition," Bradley announced suddenly, his eyes bright with mischief. "Let's make this interesting. Alex, you're always talking about people having hidden depths. Why don't you prove it?" "What do you have in mind?" Alexander asked, though something warned him he wouldn't like the answer. Bradley's grin widened. "I bet you $50 million that you can't find real love with someone completely outside our world. Someone poor, ordinary, someone who has no idea who you are." The group leaned forward, intrigued. Vanessa clapped her hands. "Oh, this is delicious, but there has to be a catch. You'd have to actually marry her." "Within 6 months," Bradley added. "And if you can't make it work for at least a year after the wedding, you lose." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. 50 million was nothing to him, but the challenge sparked something he hadn't felt in years: genuine uncertainty. "And if I win? Then we all donate 50 million to whatever charity you choose," Marcus said, clearly amused by the spectacle. "But Alex, you'd have to really try. No revealing your identity until after the wedding. The absurdity of it should have made Alexander laugh, but instead he found himself considering the terms. Perhaps this was exactly the kind of unpredictability his life needed. "You're serious about this?" he asked, scanning their eager faces. "Dead serious," Bradley confirmed. "So what do you say, Alex? Ready to discover if Alexander Blackwood can win a heart based on something other than his bank account?" Alexander stood straightening his jacket as he looked out at the city lights. Somewhere down there was a woman who would change everything. He just didn't know it yet. "You have a deal," he said, turning back to his friends with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The bet was made, and Alexander Blackwood's carefully constructed world was about to collide with something far more dangerous than any business. Rival, authentic human connection. 3 days later, Alexander found himself in a part of Queens he'd never visited, despite owning property throughout the borough. He'd traded his $1,000 suits for jeans and a simple button-down shirt, driving a modest Honda Civic instead of his usual Maserati. The transformation felt strange, like wearing a costume, but he was committed to the charade. The coffee shop Marcus had suggested was nothing like the sleek establishments in Manhattan. Been there, done that, occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone, its mismatched furniture and local artwork creating a warmth that his usual haunts lacked. The morning crowd consisted of teachers, construction workers, and students, people living paycheck to paycheck in a city that seemed designed to exhaust them. Alexander ordered a simple black coffee and found a corner table, pretending to read the newspaper while observing the patrons. He needed to find someone genuine, someone who would never suspect his true identity. The challenge was more complex than he'd anticipated. How do you approach someone when your entire adult life has been built on power dynamics and calculated interactions? "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" He looked up to see a woman holding a steaming mug and a worn paperback novel. She had shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the morning light streaming through the window, and her green eyes held a directness that immediately caught his attention. She wore scrubs, clearly a healthcare worker, and looked tired in the way that suggested long shifts rather than late-night parties. "Please sit," Alexander said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Thanks. I'm Elena Rodriguez," she said, settling into her seat with a grateful sigh. "I just finished a double shift at Mount Sinai and this place has the only decent coffee within walking distance of my apartment." "Alexander Stone," he replied, using the alias he'd prepared. "And Mount Sinai? You're a doctor?" Elena laughed, a sound that was both tired and genuine. "Nurse practitioner. I work in the emergency department. Not quite as glamorous as it sounds on TV. Mostly it's dealing with the aftermath of people's worst days." She opened her book, then paused. "Sorry, I don't mean to be antisocial, but I only have 30 minutes before I need to get some sleep." "Don't apologize," Alexander said. "What are you reading?" She held up the cover, a biography of Marie Curie. "I'm taking some additional courses to specialize in trauma care. Marie Curie's work with mobile X-ray units during World War I is fascinating. She literally drove to the front lines to help wounded soldiers." Alexander found himself genuinely intrigued. In his world, people read business journals and market analyses. "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Elena asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know. Romance novels, celebrity biographies." "Wow," Elena said, but she was smiling. "That's either honest or insulting. I can't decide which." "Honest," Alexander admitted. "I realize how that sounded. I'm not used to meeting people who work in healthcare." "What do you do?" Elena asked, taking a sip of her coffee. Alexander had prepared for this question, but sitting across from Elena's open curiosity, the rehearsed answers felt hollow. "I'm in business consulting. Nothing as important as what you do." "Everyone's work is important," Elena said simply. "The woman who cleans our hospital floors is just as crucial as the chief of surgery. We all keep the world running in different ways." The comment struck Alexander unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had spoken about work in terms of service rather than success? In his circles, careers were measured by profit margins and personal achievement, not contribution to society. "You really believe that?" he asked. "Of course, don't you?" Elena studied his face with the same attention she probably gave to patients in triage, assessing, understanding, looking for what others might miss. "I'm starting to," Alexander said, and realized he meant it. They talked for the remaining 20 minutes of Elena's break. She told him about her patients, the elderly man who came to the ER every few weeks because he was lonely, the teenager she'd helped connect with addiction resources, the immigrant, family she'd advocated for when they couldn't afford treatment. Elena spoke about her work with passion but without self-importance, as if healing people was simply what humans were supposed to do for each other. When she stood to leave, Alexander felt an unfamiliar panic. Would you like to have dinner sometime? Elena hesitated, and Alexander realized she was actually considering whether she wanted to spend time with him, not what she could gain from the association. I work crazy hours, she said finally. And I should warn you, I'm not great at dating. I tend to care more about substance than most people expect. I think I'd like that, Alexander said, and meant it completely. Elena smiled, a real smile that transformed her tired features. Okay, Alexander Stone, Friday night, 7 o'clock, but somewhere casual. I'm too exhausted for anywhere that requires heels. As she walked away, Alexander watched through the window as she headed toward a modest apartment building across the street. For the first time in years, he had no idea what would happen next. And for the first time in even longer, that uncertainty felt like a gift rather than a threat. Friday evening found Alexander standing outside a small Italian restaurant in Elena's neighborhood, second-guessing every choice he'd made in the past week. He'd researched the area extensively, trying to understand Elena's world, but standing here now, he realized how little his research had actually prepared him for this moment. The restaurant was nothing like the Michelin-starred establishments he usually frequented. Nona's kitchen occupied a narrow storefront with checkered tablecloths and walls covered in family photos spanning decades. The scent of garlic and fresh basil drifted from the open kitchen, where he could see an elderly Italian woman arguing passionately with a younger man about sauce consistency. Elena arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her look more elegant than any of the designer-clad socialites from his usual world. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked rested for the first time since he'd met her. Perfect choice, she said, surveying the restaurant. I've been wanting to try this place for months, but it's always seemed too nice for a solo dinner. Too nice? Alexander asked, genuinely confused. You know, the kind of place that's meant for sharing. Going alone would feel like I was missing the point. Elena smiled at his expression. You really aren't from around here, are you? They were seated at a small table near the window, and Alexander found himself fascinated by Elena's easy interaction with their server, an elderly Italian man who treated her like a returning family member despite this being her first visit. She asked about his grandchildren, complimented the handwritten menu, and somehow made the simple act of ordering dinner feel like a celebration. So tell me about business consulting, Elena said once they'd ordered. What kind of businesses do you work with? Alexander had prepared extensively for this conversation, creating an elaborate backstory about helping small companies improve their operations. But sitting across from Elena, who had spent her day literally saving lives, I felt impossibly heavy. It's complicated, he said finally. I help people make difficult decisions about resources and priorities. That sounds important, Elena said, and probably stressful. Do you enjoy it? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him if he enjoyed his work. Success was assumed to equal satisfaction. I used to think I did. Lately, I'm not sure. What changed? Alexander looked at Elena's face, noting the genuine curiosity there. She wasn't asking to make conversation or to gather information she could use later. She actually wanted to understand him. I think I started wondering if I was building anything meaningful, he said slowly. Success started feeling empty. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I see that sometimes in the ER. People come in after accidents or heart attacks, and you can see them realizing that all the things they thought mattered, the job stress, the status, the possessions, none of it means anything when you're facing mortality. Is that why you became a nurse? Partly, Elena said, but mostly because my little brother had leukemia when I was in high school. I spent months in pediatric wards, watching nurses hold our family together during the worst time of our lives. They didn't just treat Miguel's illness. They treated our fear, our exhaustion, our desperation. Did he? Alexander began carefully. He survived, Elena said, her face lighting up. He's 25 now, finishing his master's degree in social work. He wants to help families navigate the healthcare system the way those nurses helped us. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself sharing more than he'd intended. He told Elena about growing up with parents who measured love in achievements, about the loneliness of success, about the strange emptiness that came with having everything he'd thought he wanted. He was careful to keep his details vague, but the emotions were entirely real. Elena listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that revealed layers of his experience he'd never examined. When he mentioned feeling disconnected from meaningful relationships, she didn't offer easy solutions or platitudes. Instead, she shared her own struggles with finding authentic connections in a world that often felt designed to keep people isolated. Ikaw. Think loneliness is the great epidemic nobody talks about, Elena said as they shared tiramisu, especially in cities like New York, where everyone is so focused on getting ahead that we forget to actually connect with each other. Do you ever feel lonely? Alexander asked. All the time, Elena admitted. I love my work, but it's emotionally draining. I come home to my tiny apartment, and sometimes days go by without a real conversation with anyone who isn't bleeding or in crisis. The honesty of her answer made Alexander's chest tighten. Here was a woman who spent her days caring for others, who had devoted her life to service, and she was struggling with the same isolation that plagued him in his penthouse. Maybe that's why tonight feels different, Elena continued. It's been a long time since someone asked me what I actually think about things that matter. As they walked back toward Elena's apartment, Alexander found himself slowing his pace, reluctant for the evening to end. The neighborhood around them was quiet, tree-lined streets illuminated by old-fashioned street lamps that cast everything in a warm, golden glow. Thank you for tonight, Elena said as they reached her building. I wasn't sure what to expect, but this was really nice. Could we do it again? Alexander asked. Elena studied his face in the streetlight, and Alexander held his breath, realizing that her answer mattered more than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. I'd like that, she said finally. But Alexander, I should tell you, I don't date casually. If we're going to keep seeing each other, I need to know you're serious about getting to know me, not just looking for something temporary. The directness of her statement should have triggered Alexander's usual flight response. Instead, he found himself stepping closer. Elena, I can honestly say that everything about you has surprised me. I've never met anyone like you. She smiled, an expression that seemed to hold both hope and caution. Good night, Alexander Stone. As Alexander drove back toward Manhattan, he realized that somewhere between the coffee shop and tonight's dinner, the bet had stopped being about winning $50 million. Now, it was about winning Elena Rodriguez, and that felt infinitely more valuable and terrifying than any amount of money. 2 months into their relationship, Alexander found himself living a double life that grew more complicated by the day. He'd rented a modest apartment in Queens under his alias, complete with fake pay stubs and references that his private investigator had meticulously constructed. To Elena, he was Alexander Stone, a struggling business consultant who sometimes worked odd hours and traveled for mysterious clients. The deception should have been easy. Alexander had spent years navigating complex negotiations and hiding his true intentions in business deals. But Elena's unwavering honesty made every lie feel like a betrayal, even as he told himself it was temporary. They'd fallen into a routine that felt more natural than anything in his previous relationships. Tuesday mornings at the coffee shop when Elena worked night shifts, Thursday dinners at small restaurants in her neighborhood, weekend walks through Queens parks that Alexander had never known existed, despite owning millions of dollars in real estate throughout the borough. I have something to tell you, Elena said as they sat on a bench overlooking the East River. It was a crisp October afternoon, and she'd been unusually quiet during their walk. Alexander's stomach dropped. Had she discovered who he really was? "What is it?" "I got the promotion," Elena said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "Chief nurse practitioner for the trauma unit. It comes with a significant pay raise and, well, it means I can finally start paying off my student loans faster." Relief flooded through Alexander, followed immediately by guilt at his own deception. "Elena, that's incredible. You deserve this." "Do I?" she asked, turning to face him. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm qualified for this kind of responsibility. These doctors have gone to school for twice as long as I have, and now I'll be making decisions that affect people's lives." Alexander took her hands, struck by the contrast between her self-doubt and his own arrogance. He'd never questioned his right to make decisions that affected thousands of people, employees, tenants, entire communities displaced by his developments. Yet Elena, who had dedicated her life to helping others, worried about her worthiness. "You're the most qualified person I know," he said firmly. "Not because of your education, but because you actually care about the people you're helping. That matters more than any degree." Elena smiled, but Alexander could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. "The thing is, this promotion changes things for us. I'll be working even longer hours, and the stress level is going to be intense. I understand if that's not what you signed up for." The comment revealed so much about Elena's past experiences that Alexander felt a surge of anger toward every person who had made her believe she was too much trouble, too demanding, too complicated to love. "Elena, look at me," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. Your career matters, and I want to support you however I can. Even if it means I'll be exhausted most of the time, even if I have to cancel dates because of emergencies, even if I come home covered in other people's blood and too tired to have a conversation, especially then," Alexander said, and realized he meant it completely. That evening, Alexander found himself in an unprecedented situation, helping Elena celebrate her promotion at a dive bar in Queens, surrounded by nurses and EMTs who treated him like family simply because Elena cared about him. He watched Elena interact with her colleagues, seeing how naturally she commanded respect without demanding it, how effortlessly she balanced authority with compassion. "Your girlfriend is special," said Maria Santos, an emergency room nurse who had known Elena for 5 years. "She saved my career when I was going through my divorce. I was making mistakes because I was so distracted, and instead of reporting me, Elena covered my shifts and helped me get into counseling." "She never mentioned that," Alexander said. "She wouldn't," Maria replied. "Elena doesn't keep score of the good things she does. She just sees what needs to be done and does it." As the evening progressed, Alexander listened to story after story about Elena's quiet heroism. The way she stayed late to comfort family members, how she used her own money to buy supplies when the hospital budget ran short, her patience with difficult patients and demanding doctors alike. "Alex, right?" A young EMT named David approached him near the bar. "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "Elena's been different since she started dating you. Happier. She smiles more, laughs easier. We were worried about her for a while. She was working herself to death and never taking time for herself. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Conversation haunted Alexander as he drove Elena home that night. She fell asleep against his shoulder in the passenger seat, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day, and Alexander found himself studying her face in the glow of the streetlights. This woman had changed everything about how he understood success, purpose, and worth. She had shown him what it meant to build a life based on service rather than acquisition, to measure value in human connections rather than financial statements. But their relationship was built on a lie that grew more enormous every day. "Elena," he whispered, not wanting to wake her but needing to say the words. "I love you." She stirred slightly, a smile crossing her sleeping features. "Love you too," she murmured without opening her eyes. It was the first time either of them had said, and Alexander felt the words settle into his chest like a physical weight. He loved Elena Rodriguez with an intensity that terrified him, and every day he didn't tell her the truth made the eventual revelation more catastrophic. As he carried her sleeping form up to her apartment, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. It was time to end the deception, but first, he needed to figure out how to tell the woman he loved that their entire relationship was based on a bet between billionaires who had never understood what they were gambling with. He just hoped that when Elena learned who Alexander Blackwood really was, there would be enough love left to build something real from the ashes of his lies. Alexander had planned to tell Elena the truth on their 6-month anniversary. He'd rehearsed the conversation countless times, trying to find words that could explain the inexplicable, how a bet born from arrogance had led him to the most authentic love of his life. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It was a Tuesday morning in January when Elena's world shattered. She was rushing to meet Alexander at their usual coffee shop when she saw him through the window, not sitting at their regular table, but standing near the counter, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with a woman Elena didn't recognize. The woman was everything Elena wasn't: tall, blonde, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. She was gesturing angrily, her voice raised enough that Elena could hear fragments through the window, playing house with some nobody while avoiding your responsibilities. The board is asking questions, Alexander. This ridiculous charade has gone on long enough. Elena pushed through the door, and both Alexander and the woman turned toward her. The expression on Alexander's face, guilt, panic, and something that looked like grief, told Elena everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. Elena, Alexander began, but the woman cut him off. "Oh, you must be the charity case," the woman said, looking Elena up and down with undisguised disdain. "I'm Vanessa Montgomery. I'm sure Alexander has told you all about me." "Actually, he hasn't mentioned you at all," Elena replied, her nursing training keeping her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her chest. Vanessa laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Of course he hasn't. That would have ruined the whole experiment, wouldn't it, Alex?" "Vanessa, stop," Alexander said, his voice desperate. "Elena, let me explain." "Explain what?" Elena asked, though part of her already understood. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Alexander's vague job description, his mysterious travel schedule, the way he sometimes seemed unfamiliar with basic things like laundromats and public transportation. "You're Alexander Blackwood," Elena said quietly. It wasn't a question. The silence that followed confirmed what Elena had begun to suspect. She pulled out her phone and quickly searched the name she'd heard Vanessa use. The images that appeared showed a man in expensive suits standing next to politicians and celebrities, cutting ribbons at charity galas, accepting awards for business excellence. The man in the photos looked like Alexander, but everything else about him was foreign to her. $4 billion, Elena read from the first article. Real estate empire, penthouse on the Upper East Side. She looked up at Alexander, or whoever he really was. Business consulting? Elena, please let me explain, Alexander said, reaching for her hands. She stepped back, and the hurt in her eyes cut through him more effectively than any physical blow could have. Is any of it real? Elena asked. Your name, your job, your apartment in Queens? Or am I just some kind of social experiment? Vanessa, clearly enjoying the drama, pulled out her phone and showed Elena something on the screen. It was a bet, actually. $50 million that Alexander couldn't find real love with someone from your background. Elena's face went pale, then flushed with anger and humiliation. A bet. Elena, it started as a bet, but that's not what this is anymore, Alexander said desperately. Everything I've felt with you, everything we've shared, that's real. How would I know? Elena asked, her voice breaking. How would I know what's real when you've been lying to me about everything? The coffee shop had gone silent, other patrons pretending not to watch the drama unfolding near the window. Elena was acutely aware of their audience, of how she must look to them. The foolish poor girl who'd been duped by a billionaire's game. "I love you," Alexander said, and the sincerity in his voice almost broke Elena's resolve. "You love the idea of me," Elena replied. "You love the way I made you feel about yourself, but you can't love someone you've never been honest with." She turned to leave, but Alexander caught her arm gently. "Elena, please give me a chance to make this right." Elena looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. For a moment, Alexander thought he saw hope in her expression. Then she spoke, and her words destroyed him. "You know what hurts the most, Alexander? It's not that you lied about who you are. It's that you made me believe you respected me. You made me think that someone could see me, really see me, and find me worth loving. But this whole time, I was just a project, a challenge, a way for you to prove something to your friends. That's not true, isn't it?" Elena's voice was steady now, professional. She was using the same tone she used with difficult patients in the ER, calm, controlled, final. "You bet them that you could make a poor woman fall in love with you. Well, congratulations, Alexander, you won." She pulled away from his grasp and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. "I hope the $50 million was worth it," she said, "because you've lost something worth far more than that." Elena walked out of the coffee shop and out of Alexander's life, leaving him standing among the wreckage of the most real thing he'd ever experienced. Vanessa, who had watched the entire exchange with interest, finally spoke. "Well, that was dramatic. So shall we get back to Manhattan? The board meeting is in 2 hours, and you have an empire to run." But Alexander wasn't listening. He was staring at the door Elena had walked through, realizing that in trying to prove he could win someone's heart, he had lost his own completely. For the first time in his life, Alexander Blackwood understood what it meant to lose something that couldn't be bought, replaced, or negotiated back. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to fix what he had broken. The bet was over, but the real price was just beginning. 6 months later, Alexander would learn that Elena had refused the hospital's offer to let him fund the new trauma center wing, even though the donation would have saved hundreds of lives. She'd told the administrators that some money came with too high a cost. It would be the final lesson in a relationship that had taught him everything about love and nothing about how to keep it.